All right, so in this video, we're going to keep talking about China in time period 4, and today we're going to look at the society and the culture and the economy of China in time period 4. And I think to kind of give an overall idea of what's happening here is that China finds itself in we'll say in the 1500s onward, kind of at a crossroads. Between the old traditional stuff and the new ideas coming from Europe and the Western Hemisphere. So China is going to be kind of in a conflict over these two sets of ideas. And so what we're going to get during this period is kind of a period of cultural conflict where the old traditional stuff is going to come into conflict with new ideas coming from Europe and the Western Hemisphere, and there's going to be some conflict, not actual armed violent conflict, but like a cultural conflict. Which side is going to come out on top? So we're going to look at both of the sides of this conflict, and maybe it's better to call it a debate. So we're going to look at both sides. We're going to see how the traditional stuff is reflected, and we're going to see how the new ideas are reflected. So we'll start with the re-emergence of the old cultural traditions. So, as we said in the last video, the Ming Dynasty, and kind of we're thinking during this period about both the Ming and Qing dynasties. We're just going to kind of lump all of this together because culturally and socially, the Ming and the Qing are very similar. So, after the collapse of the Yuan dynasty, traditional Chinese traditions are reinforced kind of as a way to clear out the Mongol influence. And so these ideas are going to be very, very important in China, especially at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, but they're going to continue on throughout the rest of the time period. So we're going to see lots of old traditional stuff come back in full force. The ideas of filial piety, right? The idea of respecting your elders. This is a big idea, and it comes back in full force. So, family and clan relationships dominate society just as they used to during pre-Mongol time period. So in the Tang and Song period, family relationships dominate society. They form the basis of society. Uh, they're going to sponsor family members to become mandarins. Remember, mandarins are the people that have passed the Confucian civil service exam. So, family comes back full force. Patriarchy is going to come back full force. The Yuan dynasty were nomadic, they were Mongols, so women had more of a say during the Yuan dynasty. Now, patriarchy comes back. So, we're going to see some really patriarchal ideas and practices reemerge in China. Uh, Female infanticide, so killing female infants. We're going to see an increase in foot binding. Foot binding was more or less outlawed by the Mongols. Now it's going to come back. Marriage, the point of marriage was seen to produce male children. And husbands could, quote unquote, put aside a wife who didn't produce a son. This is still present in China today, and there is a very unsettling disparity between the number of men and women in China. So there are too many men and not enough women in China because they value boys more than they value girls. And so now, starting here, but continuing on into the future, there's a deficit of Chinese women, and that's a problem moving forward. If we look at the social hierarchy, the social hierarchy of China is going to reemerge, just like it had before the Mongols were there. So, at the top, you have the rich landowners. You have the mandarins, who are the bureaucrats, the people that passed the Confucian civil service exam. And then beneath them, you have the working classes. So the highest valued working class people were farmers. And we've mentioned this before, and that's because they produce food. And then there are other other working people, other laborers. This stuff was all seen as honest and noble work because you're making something or you're providing a service. Now, here's where things start to change as a result of what's happening in time period 4. As always, when we've talked about China, merchants were near the bottom of society. Because being a merchant was not seen as noble, hard work. It was just making money. But here's where the money changes things. As we've seen elsewhere, money equals power and influence. So while merchants themselves are near the bottom of society, because they have money, they can afford to hire tutors for their children to take the Confucian Civil Service exam. And if their children become mandarins, well, then their family goes to the top. So even if they are a merchant, because they have money, that gives them a path to the top of the social hierarchy. Money equals power. And so if you are a group that is not looked highly upon in society, but you have money, that's your ticket to the top. Notice a difference here, because in Europe, the merchants were loved and encouraged. And this is what led to exploration and colonization. In China, merchants were looked down upon. And that might lead to maybe cultural stagnation. Beneath the merchants, the people that were liked even less than the merchants were what were called the mean people. Not because they were mean, but that's just the term for them, the mean people. These are people that are on the fringes of society. So we might have here soldiers. Soldiers were seen as a necessary evil. We need them to protect the borders, protect the country, but nobody wants to be a soldier. That's not something you would aspire to be. Beneath them, you would probably find servants, beggars, entertainers, prostitutes. But remember, It's all about money. And there was a path for social mobility. So if you could afford to take the social service or the civil service exam yourself, or to pay to have your children do it, there was a path for you to go to the top. There was this sense of social mobility and a meritocracy. That people, the best people, do the job. So there was an idea of social mobility, but you had to have a little bit of money first. The last thing we'll talk about is in terms of the old ideas, is the idea of popular culture. And popular culture emerges in societies as they get richer and more literate. And China was both rich and literate. Remember, education was a very big part of Chinese society going all the way back to the Han Dynasty. China was always really rich. So popular culture in China has been around for a while, and now it's re-emerging. And popular culture is the cultural activities of regular people. What do regular people like to do? And what we'll see here when we look at the cultural activities of regular people is that it is not Confucian. Because think about it like this. After work, where you've been using Confucian principles all day, you don't want to relax by reading more Confucius. You want to read other stuff. And there was a wide variety of stuff to read. And it's exactly the kind of stuff that you would imagine that people would want to read in their downtime. Printing is common. Paper is cheap. So there's pretty much anything you might want to read. So there's all sorts of stories. There are, war stories, horror stories, adventure stories. We might even see some pornography, because this is what people might want to do. Doesn't have to have any literary or cultural value. It's just the kind of stuff you read for fun. There's other stuff that brings up questions or concerns not mentioned in Confucian texts. So here are a couple examples of literature that's not Confucian and brings up stuff that Confucius might not have written about. So one book is called The Dream of the Red Chamber. Which is a story about two teenagers from rival families who fall in love. I've never heard of that story before. Another story is called Journey to the West. Which is an actual kind of a true story about the travels of a Buddhist monk I think we might have even talked about the travels of this Buddhist monk back when we started talking about Buddhism moving to China. But it was spiced up with like supernatural parts. And I think he had a magical monkey as a sidekick. Which kind of sounds like fun. So this is kind of the reemergence of Chinese stuff after the Yuan dynasty. So there's a big re-emphasis on Confucianism, on the way things China used to be built on, like the old social hierarchy. And we do see a little bit of Chinese literature emerging that's not necessarily Confucian. This is homegrown native Chinese stuff. At the same time, though, there are new ideas. New ideas and new things come to China. And China is having to reckon with them. Now, we've seen this in the past, and what we've noticed is that when confronted with new things, China prefers stability over change. We've seen this before when the Tang Emperor tried to outlaw Buddhism. So this is a common Chinese reaction to new stuff. But as we also know, the new stuff remained anyway. So one of the new things that shows up in China are new food crops. And this is due to the Columbian Exchange, bringing this stuff through Asia to China. So these new food crops grow great in China, just like they grow well in Europe. So we're talking about corn, potatoes, and most importantly for China, sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are really popular in China. These crops grow in all soil and produce a lot of food. So during this period, we see just an explosion of population growth. And even with epidemic disease, the population of China just continued to go up throughout the time period. This had a number of problems, some of which we've already mentioned, like the female infanticide. That becomes a even bigger problem during this time. But there's an economic problem with this too, because it becomes really cheap to hire labor. And if you can just hire laborers, you have no need to innovate. So while the Europeans are coming up with new machines and new inventions to make things faster, the Chinese don't do that. The Chinese just continue to do things in the old way. They just hire more people to do it. So they're going to get an increase in economic output, but they're going to be using the old methods to make stuff. They're going to try to, additionally, heavily regulate foreign trade. Because, and this is a big point, the Chinese view Europeans as a source of instability because they bring new ideas. So the Chinese view Europeans as a source of instability. There is going to be trade, but it's illegal. And it's going to be those quote unquote Japanese pirates who are going to be doing this smuggling. The Qing emperors are a little bit more lenient. But generally speaking, the Chinese leadership view the Europeans as a source of instability. One last thing we'll mention, and I'll just put it over here on the side, is that there are going to be Christian missionaries. Just like there were Christian missionaries to the New World, there are going to be Christian missionaries to China too. These missionaries are not going to be nearly as successful they're not going to be successful in converting people, but they will kind of get people interested in Europeans. So like the regular people will kind of be curious about these Christian missionaries, and they will bring reports of China back to Europe, which is kind of an ominous way of ending this, because when we get into time period 5, the Europeans are going to start coming to China like they started coming to North and South America. But we'll worry about all of that stuff once we get there. This is the last video we'll make about China in time period 4. What we want to do in our last video on this chapter, though, is look at Japan. And Japan and China are going to kind of follow the same path, but I think we need to do a little bit more of like fleshing out what's going on in Japan. So that will be our next video. We'll talk about Japan. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.